Imagine a world where women were seen as little more than property, their lives controlled by the men around them. From medieval queens to humble peasants, their struggles, resilience, and quiet defiance shaped history in ways we often overlook. Tonight, we're taking you on a journey back in time to uncover the untold stories of medieval women, their triumphs, their heartaches, and their fight for agency in a world that sought to silence them. Get ready for a deep dive into the forgotten heroes of the past. It's a history worth remembering. Hello, fellow night owl. Before we begin our journey back in time, I want to take a moment to greet you wherever and whenever you may be. Whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, where you are, I'm glad you've chosen to join us here for tonight's gentle travel through the eras of our ancestors. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always fascinating to see the diverse range of places and time zones represented by this wonderful community of history enthusiasts and curious minds. And if you enjoy this kind of calm, immersive storytelling that blends education and relaxation, please consider subscribing so you don't miss future adventures through the annals of history. But for now, get nice and comfortable, settle in, and let me gently transport you back to a very different time and place. Tonight we'll be exploring what life was like for women in medieval Europe, a period spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century AD. It was an era of knights and castles, plagues and crusades, soaring cathedrals and sprawling manors, a time of great change and upheaval, but also of entrenched traditions and social hierarchies. For the vast majority of women, daily life in the Middle Ages was a far cry from the romanticised images of chivalry, courtly love, and fairy tale princesses that tend to dominate our modern perceptions. The reality was often harsh, oppressive, and unforgiving, with few rights or freedoms afforded to women. From birth until death, most were subordinate to men, first their fathers, then their husbands, with little opportunity to determine their own fates. Of course, experiences varied somewhat depending on social class and circumstances. A wealthy noblewoman and a poor peasant girl undoubtedly led very different lives. But across the spectrum, women faced many of the same fundamental challenges and limitations, deeply rooted in the prevailing cultural beliefs and practices of the time. In the hours ahead, we'll do a deep dive into many facets of medieval womanhood, tracing the typical trajectory from childhood through adolescence, marriage, and motherhood into old age. We'll explore their daily routines and responsibilities, their role within the family and society at large, the health issues and hardships they faced, and the strict moral codes that governed their behaviour. Along the way, I'll share the intimate stories of several real medieval women whose lives left a mark on the historical record. For better or worse, queens and commoners, nuns and noblewomen, healers and accused heretics, each one with a unique perspective to add to our understanding of this multifaceted era. But before we fully immerse ourselves in the distant past, let's start by setting the scene. Imagine, if you will, a world lit only by fire, a world where the rhythm of life revolved around the rising and setting of the sun, a world of extremes, of opulent grandeur for a privileged few and grinding poverty for the downtrodden masses. Picture a landscape dotted with imposing stone castles, their towers and battlements looming over the countryside. Nearby, thatched roof cottages clustered around the manor house, smoke curling from their chimneys. In the distance, the spires of a grand cathedral pierced the sky, bells tolling to mark the canonical hours. The air would have been filled with the earthy scents of wood smoke, baking bread, and farm animals. The soundtrack, a cacophony of barking dogs, braying livestock, ringing hammers, and axes from the blacksmith and woodcutter. People toiled ceaselessly from sunup to sundown, with little respite from the daily struggle for survival. Into this world a medieval girl was born. From her first breath, the odds were stacked against her in a way that's difficult for us to fully wrap our minds around today. In our modern world of advanced healthcare, technology, human rights, and equality, it's sobering to confront just how brutally different life was for our foremothers. So as we step back in time tonight to walk a mile in their shoes, it's important to acknowledge our own 21st century perspective and prejudices. We cannot view the medieval world through a purely modern lens, nor judge its inhabitants by our own standards and values. Our aim is simply to better understand the context and conditions these women inhabited, to listen to their stories with an open mind, and in doing so heighten our awareness of both how far we've come and how far we still have to go in terms of gender equality. So without further ado, let us begin at the beginning, with a glimpse into the tenuous early years of a medieval woman's life. In the Middle Ages, childhood was a precarious and fleeting stage of life, perhaps even more so for girls. And for boys, infant mortality rates were heartbreakingly high by modern standards, with many estimates suggesting that 30 to 50% of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Accidents, malnutrition and disease claimed countless young lives, and the spectre of an early grave hovered over every cradle. Even for those fortunate enough to survive infancy, the concept of childhood as we know it today, a carefree time of play, learning and discovery, scarcely existed for the vast majority. Children were viewed as miniature adults, with little special regard for their developmental needs and vulnerabilities. As soon as they were old enough to walk and talk, kids were expected to contribute to the family economy in whatever way they could manage, often assisting their parents with daily chores and labour. Childhood was essentially an apprenticeship for adulthood, a time to learn critical skills and prepare to take on mature roles and responsibilities. For girls, this meant focusing almost exclusively on domestic matters, with little opportunity for formal education. Unlike some of their male peers who might attend a parish school or receive tutoring from a learned cleric, most girls' schooling took place strictly within the home. From a very young age, girls were indoctrinated into their prescribed place in society. Modesty, obedience and submission were the chief virtues instilled in them, along with practical homemaking abilities like cooking, sewing, spinning wool and tending to children and the sick. Under the tutelage of their mothers, grandmothers and older sisters, girls learned by observation and imitation, absorbing the habits and mores that would shape the rest of their lives. Biblical stories and religious instruction also played a key role in a young girl's moral upbringing, cementing her subservient position in the God-ordained hierarchy of the sexes. While some noble women might be taught to read and write, this was the exception rather than the rule. For the average peasant girl, formal learning was vanishingly rare, and female literacy rates were extremely low, hovering around 5%. Even among the upper classes, the education of girls was simply not seen as a priority compared to ensuring they were prepared for their ultimate destiny, becoming wives and mothers. And indeed, the end of childhood often came abruptly and decisively, with the onset of puberty and marriage. In the Middle Ages, marriage was less about love or personal fulfillment than it was a pragmatic arrangement designed to strengthen family alliances, increase economic stability, and produce the next generation. For girls, marriages were typically arranged by their father or another male relative, with little input from the bride herself. Legally, the minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though betrothals and negotiations might begin much earlier. In practice, however, most women married in their late teens to early 20s, especially among the peasantry, where girls were vital sources of domestic labour for their birth families. Still, it wasn't entirely uncommon for very young girls, particularly in noble and royal circles, to be married off to much older men for political or financial gain. We can only imagine the terror and trepidation of a sheltered adolescent girl barely past the threshold of puberty, faced with the prospect of leaving her family to join a stranger's household. One poignant example of such a child bride was Isabeau of Bavaria, who at age 15 was wed to King Charles VI of France, a man 16 years her senior. A renowned beauty plucked from the minor nobility, Isabeau was a pawn in a political alliance between France and Bavaria, her personal feelings ultimately of little consequence. Thrown into the strange and glittering world of the French court, the young queen was woefully unprepared for the weighty responsibilities that awaited her. Chief among these was the pressure to produce a male heir to secure the royal line, a duty that would utterly consume the next chapter of her life as a wife and mother. From our modern vantage point, it's difficult to overstate the physical and emotional toll that the transition from maidenhood to marriage would have taken on these young medieval brides. Torn from the only life they had known and thrust into an often overwhelming new role, many must have felt profoundly isolated and unready. Wedding ceremonies themselves were less elaborate affairs than we might picture today, with little of the white lace and pageantry that would come to characterise nuptials in later centuries. For common folk, a simple exchange of vows before witnesses, perhaps presided over by a priest, would suffice to seal the contract. Only the nobility could afford more lavish celebrations, and even then the focus was more on sealing alliances and celebrating the families joining together than on the individual couple. The bride was essentially handed from one man's authority to another's, her own identity subsumed into that of her new husband. In some cases, Marriage also marked a definitive break between a woman and her birth family. While poor peasant brides usually stayed close to their parents, it was customary for a new wife to leave her childhood home and move into the household of her husband and in-laws. There she would be expected to quickly adapt to an unfamiliar domestic hierarchy, learning to navigate relations with her husband's kin while establishing her own place in the pecking order. Integrating smoothly into this new family unit could be a real challenge, especially for young brides still learning to manage a household on their own. But of all the weighty responsibilities that a young wife shouldered, none was more consequential or potentially perilous than the expectation that she would bear children early and often in an era of limited medical knowledge and high mortality rates. Pregnancy and childbirth were risky endeavours that claimed many promising lives. Join me next time as we explore the joys and sorrows of medieval motherhood, the pressure to produce heirs, the scorn faced by those who bore only daughters, and the heart-wrenching losses endured by women of all stations. We'll get to know one of the era's most fascinating maternal figures in Eleanor of Castile, and trace her turbulent reproductive history across decades of queenship. Until then, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect on the little girls of the Middle Ages, the would-be brides and mothers whose childhoods ended almost before they began. Try to imagine yourself in their embroidered slippers facing an uncertain future in an unforgiving world. Sleep well, and know that when next we meet, we'll once more shine a light into history's hidden corners and give voice to the often voiceless women who lived there. For theirs is a story that deserves to be told, no matter how distant or difficult it may be. Thank you, as always, for spending this time with me. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon for another boring bedtime story plucked from the pages of our collective past. Until then, farewell. As we've seen, medieval women were subject to intense oppression and restriction in virtually every area of life. From birth to death, their existences were tightly controlled by the men around them. Fathers, husbands, brothers, priests. A woman had little autonomy over her own body, mind, or destiny. She was always under the watchful eye of male authority figures, quick to punish any perceived transgressions. The harsh morality of the Middle Ages, rooted in religious doctrine, placed women in an impossible bind. On one hand, church teachings cast women as inherently sinful and morally weak, daughters of temptress Eve. Their beauty was seen as a threat, a tool for leading men astray. Women were expected to cover their hair and dress modestly to avoid inflaming male lust. At the same time, as wives and mothers, women's primary duty was to be obedient, chaste and pure. Any hint of flirtatiousness or sexual impropriety could ruin a woman's reputation. Adultery, even if committed by a husband, was always seen as the wife's failure. A jealous or disgruntled husband could easily accuse his wife of infidelity, condemning her to punishment. And those punishments for accused adulteresses were brutal and humiliating. A woman might be paraded through the streets, stripped to the waist, while a town crier announced her sins. She could be whipped, dunked in water, or locked in the stocks while crowds jeered and threw rotten food. In extreme cases, the penalty was death. But a woman need not even commit a crime to be subjected to public mortification. Gossiping, scolding, and nagging were also cause for painful embarrassment. Like the scold's bridle, this iron muzzle enclosed the head with a metal bit pressing down the tongue. The accused woman would be led through town to endure mockery and shame. Even for those rare women who sought a religious vocation, freedom remained elusive. Nuns lived ascetic lives, with their days dictated by rigid prayer schedules and their bodies concealed under shapeless habits. Silence was golden, and none was to be seen and not heard. A few women went to even further extremes, voluntarily imprisoning themselves for life as anchoresses. These religious women were quite literally walled into small cells attached to churches, with only a small window to pass food and receive the sacrament. Most would never emerge again, having freely chosen this grim fate. One of the most famous anchoresses was the English mystic Julian of Norwich. As a young woman, Julian became gravely ill and experienced a series of divine visions. After recovering, she decided to withdraw from the world and live in permanent seclusion. For decades, Julian lived in her cramped anchor hold, spending her days in prayer and meditation. She wrote about her mystical experiences in her book Revelations of Divine Love, believed to be the first English-language book written by a woman. Julian found spiritual freedom in her confinement, but for most it was a grim sentence. As Julian scribbled away in her cell, most medieval women toiled in back-breaking drudgery. Their daily reality was nothing short of a waking nightmare by modern standards. Domestic violence was a fact of life, seen as a husband's prerogative to correct an erring wife. The story of Marguerite of Flanders illustrates just how vulnerable even highborn women could be. Marguerite was the daughter of King Louis II and was expected to make a glittering dynastic marriage. Instead, she was abducted several times by her husband, the cruel Daves, who kept her imprisoned for years. Marguerite endured unimaginable abuse at his hands, bearing many children. When Marguerite finally escaped and fled to her father, her ordeal was far from over. The king sided with his daughter at first, but Daves later successfully argued in court that a wife was essentially the property of her husband. Poor Marguerite was forced to return to her abuser, who continued to torment her until his death. The tragic plight of this French princess was sadly all too common. Women were essentially chattel, belonging to men. Without the protection of family or fortune, common women were utterly disposable. A rural woman might break her back doing farm labour from dawn to dusk or injure herself hauling water and firewood. Her exhausted body would be expected to produce a brood of children, always hoping for sons. If she managed to survive the dangers of childbirth, she had to contend with near starvation as food was. Scarce malnutrition and repetitive stress would age her prematurely. Disease and poor hygiene ravaged her health. Fleas, lice and bedbugs were constant companions. She was old before her time. For unmarried women, survival often meant resorting to begging or prostitution. Unattached females were viewed with deep suspicion by medieval society. Women were expected to be under the dominion of a man, either a husband or male relative. Without that protection and control, they were seen as dangerous and unnatural. Those who sold their bodies to scrape by lived on the margins in every sense. Prostitutes were simultaneously necessary and reviled. Cities like London had designated red light districts such as Sodok, where brothels could operate under licence. But Wabitai, the woman caught plying her trade outside those boundaries, severe fines and time in the stocks awaited them. As bad as their situation was, prostitutes still fared better than other desperate women. Those who sank into vagrancy or joined wandering bands of criminals risked brutal treatment at the hands of the law. Medieval justice was swift and merciless. Women could be flogged, branded, or subjected to mutilation for crimes as petty as theft. But all women, whether princess or prostitute, lived in the shadow of an even darker threat. The spectre of violence against women loomed large, an inescapable hazard. Men of all classes, from nobles to peasants, saw the women around them as fair game to be used and abused. The notion of consent was virtually non-existent. Only if the victim was an unmarried virgin, ideally of good family, were her claims taken seriously. Even then, the best she could hope for was that her attacker might be pressured into marrying her. After all, he had ruined her, so it was the least he could do to make her his wife. The woman's feelings in the matter were irrelevant. Perhaps nothing illustrates the precarious position of medieval women as much as the fear of witchcraft accusations that hung over their heads like the sword of Damocles. In a world where bad harvests or sickness striking down cattle could threaten a community's very survival, women were convenient scapegoats. Any woman who stood out, whether for her knowledge of her blaw or her failure to conform, could find herself denounced. Midwives and female healers were especially vulnerable, targeted for their dark arts. A woman who eased the pains of childbirth or nursed villages through disease was just as easily painted as a consort of the devil. If crops failed or babies fell ill, she was blamed for wielding evil magic. Witch trials were sham affairs with the outcome decided from the start. Accused women were stripped and searched for the devil's mark, some blemish or mole that supposedly proved their guilt. Confessions were extracted under torture, and not confessing was also seen as proof, so the innocent were damned either way. The lucky ones got off with being dunked in water or publicly humiliated. But many accused witches met a fiery end, burned at the stake before a jeering mob. The palpable misogyny of the witch trials served as a potent reminder to all medieval women that they walked a razor's edge. Any misstep or false move could prove fatal. Given this constant suffocating oppression and threat of male violence, it's astounding that medieval women managed to carve out any shreds of agency and self-determination. But in small ways, some remarkable individuals did resist and rebel against the life that men and society prescribed for them. There was Christine Depar, one of the first professional female authors who dared to challenge the rampant woman-hating in male scholarly works. Her book, The Book of the City of Ladies, compiles the stories of notable women and directly confronts misogynistic arguments. As a widow who wrote to support herself and her children, Depar faced condescension from male intellectuals, but she persisted nonetheless, arguing passionately for women's moral and intellectual equality. Centuries ahead of her time, Depar planted the early seeds of what would eventually blossom into feminism. And in the lives of many ordinary women, there were quiet acts of resilience and solidarity. Women relied on each other for support in the birthing room and formed networks to care for each other's children in the fields. They shared gossip and complaints, finding fleeting moments of levity and laughter amid the toil. Mothers carefully taught their daughters the skills they would need to survive their lot in life, from managing a household to navigating the treacherous waters of marriage. They armed the next generation with the tools to endure, if not overcome, the hardships that awaited them. Yes, the overall picture of life for medieval women is grim. Their world was one of relentless drudgery, suffering and submission. And yet, it's crucial to recognise that women were never merely passive victims. They found ways to claim power and agency where they could, in ways big and small. Through it all, they displayed remarkable grit, grace and resilience. As we close out our journey through the harrowing realities of medieval womanhood, it's worth reflecting on just how far we've come. Today, the notion that women are the property of men, to be disposed of as they see fit, is abhorrent. And while accusations of witchcraft may still fly in some cultures, we no longer burn women at the stake for crimes they did not commit. But even as we acknowledge this progress, we must remain clear-eyed about the very real injustices and oppressions women continue to face worldwide. The forms may have changed, but the fight for true equity and freedom is far from over. Medieval misogyny may seem like a distant relic, but its echoes still reverberate today. So as you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate the profound strength and courage of the women who came before us. They bore the unbearable and, in so doing, paved the way for future generations to forge a better path. We stand on the shoulders of the medieval women who endured, and we owe it to their memory to keep striving for a world where every woman can live with dignity, safety and liberty. The road ahead may be long, but as Christine de Pizan so eloquently wrote, the female sex has been left defenceless for so long that some men think it is the way it has to be. Brick by brick, we are proving those men wrong and building a new reality. Medieval women may have lived in a time of darkness, but their unbreakable spirits lit the way forward, candles in the night, guiding us on. And that, my friends, is boring history worth remembering at bedtime. Sweet dreams. The poor hygiene and sanitation of medieval times made life unpleasant for everyone, but women faced extra challenges in managing their monthly cycles. Without the convenience of modern menstrual products, most women relied on homemade cloth pads or rags that were washed and reused. These offered minimal absorption and leak protection. Some women resorted to using grass, hay, sheep's wool, or even moss to stuff into their undergarments during their periods. Needless to say, chafing and infections were common problems. Bathing was a rare luxury for medieval women of lower classes. Even if they had access to a river or stream for washing, the water was often polluted with human and animal waste, spreading diseases. Most people subscribed to the belief that water could carry sickness into the body through the pores of the skin. This led to infrequent bathing, maybe a few times per year, supplemented by sponge baths. Lice and fleas were rampant. Laundry was another constant battle. Clothing had to be washed by hand in a pot over the fire or in a river, scrubbed against a washboard, then wrung out and hung to dry. The process was back-breaking and time-consuming. Wet, heavy clothing placed near the fire was a burn risk. Most families owned only 1 to 2 sets of clothing that were worn threadbare, making the laundering even more difficult. In the castles and manor houses of the nobility, standards of cleanliness were somewhat better, but still fell far short of modern expectations. The wealthy could afford servants to heat water, prepare baths and launder clothing more regularly. Scented oils and herbs masked odour. However, even the grandest stone fortress lacked running water, flush toilets and proper waste disposal. Chamber pots were emptied out windows into the courtyards. It's telling that one of the most popular and precious wedding gifts an aristocratic medieval bride could receive was a flea fur. A fur wrap meant to attract fleas away from the body. Pests were inescapable. Rats scurrying through bedchambers and banquet halls spread the fleas that carried the bubonic plague. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it wiped out an estimated 60% of the population. Women were on the front lines of nursing the sick and mourning the dead. The widespread death and devastation of the plague years disrupted society and accelerated changes in medieval medical practices. Tending to the ill fell largely on women in their roles as wives, mothers, midwives and nuns at a time when physicians were expensive and few in number. The care women provided was critical. Convents often served as hospitals of last resort for the poor and destitute. Elderly nuns passed down herbal folk remedies to their novices. Some women parlayed their healing knowledge into careers as midwives, apothecaries and surgeons. In the 14th century Paris, Jacqueline Felicia de Almania was put on trial by the medical faculty of the University of Paris for illegally practicing medicine as a woman. Her patients, including priests and noblewomen, testified on her behalf, praising her diagnostic and treatment skills that surpassed male physicians. Nevertheless, she was excommunicated and barred from practicing further. It was a rare woman who managed to succeed in the male-dominated medical field. More often, a woman's home remedies were labelled as witchcraft and superstition. Anyone deviating from approved church doctrine ran the risk of being branded a heretic or witch. Midwives were especially vulnerable to accusations of sorcery if a baby or mother died in childbirth. If a woman was knowledgeable about plants and herbs for easing pain or ending pregnancy, she could be condemned for consorting with the devil. The wise woman of a village might be respected as a healer in her youth but reviled as a witch in her old age. Inquisitors interrogated and tortured suspects, coercing confessions. Once a woman was accused, it was near impossible to prove her innocence, especially if she was unmarried or elderly, with no male relatives to defend her. Women comprised over 80% of the estimated 50,000 to 100,000 unfortunate souls executed for witchcraft between 1500 and 1660. Witch hunts and burnings were the ultimate manifestation of the medieval patriarchy's need to control and punish women who dared defy cultural norms. Even a woman who strove to be a perfect wife, mother, and Christian was still tainted by Eve's original sin, viewed as weak-willed and prone to temptation. To safeguard her virtue, a woman's role was submission and service, hidden away in the domestic realm of motherhood. Venturing out invited male attention and the ruin of her reputation. An unmarried woman was a liability, unable to fulfill her sole purpose of producing children. A married woman was her husband's property, to be protected or punished as he saw fit, regardless of her feelings on the matter. With so much of a woman's worth bound to her fertility, the pressure to bear children was immense. Pregnancy was a state of hope and fear, as the spectre of death in childbirth loomed. Noble women were considered successful if they produced at least one male heir who survived infancy. Queens who failed to deliver a prince might be cast aside in favour of a more fertile consort. The chilling fates of Henry VIII's wives come to mind. Peasant women had more reason to dread pregnancy and childbirth. Without access to the best food, living conditions and attendance, malnourishment left many women with rickets, a vitamin D deficiency that deformed their pelvises, making labour even more difficult and dangerous. Birthing a baby often took days, even a week, of sweat, blood and pain. If labour seemed unending, a midwife might recommend opening the official birthing girdle of the Virgin Mary, kept in the local parish treasury, and placing it on the mother's stomach to speed delivery. This relic was of little practical use. Midwives did their best to ease suffering with herbal tinctures and salves, but could only hope to catch the baby and save the mother. Fata Isab's plight was not unique. For girls born into noble families, one's wedding day often came well before one's 18th birthday. Political alliances and strengthening family ties took precedence over a young bride's readiness or personal choice in the matter. Though a privileged queen, Isabeau still faced many of the same challenges as women of lesser means when it came to marriage and motherhood. In medieval times, the pressure to produce a male heir weighed heavily. A woman's worth was largely measured by her fertility and the number of surviving sons she bore. Failure to deliver a boy brought shame and scorn even for queens. Childbirth was a harrowing ordeal, fraught with danger in an age of crude medical knowledge. With each pregnancy, a woman quite literally took her life in her hands. Queen Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward III of England, endured a staggering 16 pregnancies over 28 years in the late 13th century. Remarkably, she survived them all. though many of the children sadly did not. Her trials were a testament to the strength and resilience of medieval women in the face of unimaginable adversity. For the great majority who were commoners, not queens, daily life revolved around a relentless string of household chores and back-breaking labour from sunup to sundown. If a woman wasn't cooking, cleaning, sewing, or looking after children, she was likely toiling alongside her husband in the fields, fetching water or gathering firewood. Privacy was a luxury largely unknown to the average family in the Middle Ages. Most dwellings were small, cramped spaces where everyone ate, slept, and passed their lives in very close quarters. Beds were shared out of necessity, a common enough practice, but one that could certainly breed tension and strife between couples or parents and children. Hygiene and sanitation left much to be desired by modern standards. Fleas, lice, and other pests were facts of life. Chamber pots sat within arm's reach, and waste was often tossed into the streets. It's no wonder that disease ran rampant in medieval towns and cities, but perhaps no aspect of a woman's life was as trying and tragic as the lack of control over her own destiny. The concept of personal freedom and self-determination as we know it today simply did not exist for the vast majority of women in the Middle Ages. From cradle to grave, a woman's path was dictated by the men in her life. Fathers, husbands, brothers, sons. Even a woman of considerable talents and intellect was hard-pressed to forge an independent existence. The French writer Christine de Pizan stands out as a rare exception. After losing her husband at a young age, de Pizan defied convention by supporting herself and her children as a professional scribe and author. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she imagined an allegorical city populated by great women of history and mythology. It was a revolutionary act of the imagination in a time when the prevailing wisdom held that women were weak, fickle creatures, incapable of reason or virtue. But de Pizan's proto-feminist thinking was centuries ahead of its time. For most medieval women, their bodies were not fully their own. They were at the mercy of their husbands' desires and whims, subject to physical and sexual abuse with little recourse. Marital rape was not a concept, as a woman was considered her husband's property. Domestic violence was a husband's prerogative. If a beaten wife dared to complain, she was more likely to be chastised for provoking his anger than to see justice served. Even a high-born lady had little protection against an abusive spouse. When Marguerite, the Countess of Flanders, displeased her cruel husband Louis of Maille, he had her abducted, imprisoned, and threatened with execution in the 14th century. Her story reads like a Gothic nightmare, but it was all too real for countless medieval women. The Church, which permeated every aspect of medieval society, often reinforced oppressive attitudes toward women. Ever since Eve tempted Adam with the forbidden fruit, women had been seen as inherently sinful, morally suspect seductresses who led men astray. Female sexuality was something to be stifled and strictly controlled. A woman's foremost duty was to remain chaste and pure, ideally as a virgin consecrated to Christ, but if not, as a virtuous wife and mother. Woe betide any woman who stepped outside those narrow lines of acceptable behaviour. The consequences could be severe: a ruined reputation, abandonment, physical punishment, even death in extreme cases. Some pious women sought to escape the dangers and disappointments of the outside world by retreating into religious seclusion. The English mystic Julian of Norwich chose to be walled into a small cell attached to a church in the early 15th century, receiving food and necessities through a small window. There she spent decades in solitary prayer and contemplation, even writing a remarkable series of revelations. For her, the anchoress's cell meant safety and spiritual purpose, but to modern eyes, it looks a lot like solitary confinement. As we've seen, life for the medieval woman was defined by constriction, of opportunity, of body, of spirit. Corseted by rigid gender roles, corseted by religious doctrine, confined to the domestic sphere, she endured tremendous hardship and often died young. But then, as now, women found ways to make their mark, to assert their agency, to fight back against their oppression in ways big and small. Through grit and grace, fury and faith, tears and toil, they persevered. Though the centuries have brought hard-won freedoms and progress, the spectre of misogyny that haunted the Middle Ages has not fully released its hold on the present day. In our own time, we are still reckoning with many of the same issues: unequal treatment, the policing of women's bodies, gender-based violence, and discrimination. In learning about the trials faced by our foremothers, we come to appreciate their strength all the more. and to see how far we have yet to go. As we remember the women of the distant past, we honour their sacrifices, their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. We owe it to them to keep striving for a world in which a woman's worth is measured not by the son she bears or the home she keeps, but by the force of her intellect, the depth of her compassion, the fire of her conviction, the greatness of her soul. The gloom and chill of a typical medieval peasant dwelling is difficult for us to fathom today, accustomed as we are to modern comforts and conveniences. Imagine, if you will, a 1 or 2 room hovel. Walls erected from wooden stakes, interwoven with sticks and packed with a crude mixture of mud, straw and manure. The floor was simply hard-packed dirt, trodden by the feet of generations. If the family was slightly better off, they might enjoy the relative luxury of a few rough-hewn wooden planks laid across the earthen floor. But there would be little respite from the damp and the cold seeping up from the ground, chilling one to the bone. The thatched roof overhead might keep out the worst of the rain, but it was a constant battle to patch the leaks and keep the vermin at bay. In one corner of this dismal abode, a medieval woman crouched over the hearth, stoking the smoky fire. Soot stained her face and homespun woolen dress. Her reddened, chapped hands expertly wielded a cast-iron pot, stirring a watery pottage, the mainstay of a peasant family's diet. Into the bubbling liquid went whatever meagre vegetables could be spared from the harvest, along with a precious scrap or two of salted pork on a feast day, if they were lucky. This was the domain of the medieval housewife, a dim, suffocating world bounded by the bare earthen walls of the cottage and the muddy trackways of the village beyond. From dawn to dusk, her life revolved around an unceasing round of toil, feeding the fire, hauling water, cooking, spinning, sewing, washing, scrubbing, and tending to the needs of her husband and children. A woman's work is never done, as the old saying goes, and nowhere was this truer than in the Middle Ages. While her husband laboured in the fields or perhaps plied a trade as a blacksmith or carpenter in the village, a woman's place was firmly in the home. Her role was to be the subservient caretaker, with little thought given to her own needs, desires or ambitions. The tools of her trade were simple and few: a couple of cast-iron pots, some wooden bowls and utensils, a stone quern for grinding grain into flour, a spindle and distaff for spinning wool into thread. With these meagre implements, she was expected to work domestic miracles, stretching scant resources to feed and clothe her family. But even as she stirred the pottage and kneaded the dense black bread that was the staple of the medieval peasant diet, a woman's mind might drift to higher things. The village priest's Sunday sermon had spoken of the Virgin Mary, that paragon of feminine virtue who had birthed the Saviour himself. Surely there must be some greater purpose to a woman's life than this endless drudgery. Such dangerous thoughts were quickly quashed, however. For a medieval woman, the path to salvation lay not in grandiose dreams, but in humble submission to her husband and to God. To strive for anything more was to risk accusations of pride, willfulness, or, worst of all, witchcraft. No, far better to keep one's head down, one's virtue intact, and pray for the best in the life to come. For in the mortal realm, a woman's lot was one of unrelenting hardship and servitude. And woe betide any woman who dared to step out of line or question her station. As we shall see in the stories to come, one such woman who dared to dream of a different kind of life was Christine de Pizan. Born in Venice in 1364, Christine's father was a renowned physician and astrologer who secured a position at the court of King Charles V of France when Christine was just a small child. Growing up in the rarefied intellectual atmosphere of the royal court, Christine enjoyed the very best education available to a medieval girl. She learned to read and write in Latin and French, studied classic works of literature and philosophy, and even had access to the king's magnificent library, a repository of knowledge unimaginable to most of her contemporaries. Her father, progressive for his time, believed in cultivating his daughter's mind and encouraged her scholarly pursuits. At the age of 15, Christine was married off to a nobleman named Etienne de Castel. It was an arranged match, as was typical for the time, but by all accounts the couple grew to love and respect one another deeply. Christine bore 3 children and settled into the expected role of a dutiful wife and mother. But Christine's domestic tranquility was not to last. In the space of a few short years, she lost her beloved husband to an outbreak of plague, followed by her father's death soon after. At the age of 25, Christine found herself a widow and an orphan, left alone to fend for herself and her young children in a world that had little use for an educated woman without a man's protection. Facing financial ruin and the loss of her cherished library, Christine made a courageous and virtually unprecedented decision. She would support her family through her writing, becoming one of Europe's first professional female authors. With quill and ink, Christine carved out a place for herself in the almost exclusively male domain of medieval literature. She began by writing love ballads and devotional poetry, genres deemed suitably feminine and unthreatening. But as her confidence and reputation grew, Christine turned her mind to weightier matters. In her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, she crafted an impassioned defence of women against the misogynistic attitudes of her time. With elegant, incisive prose, Christine dismantled the pervasive notion that women were inherently morally and intellectually inferior to men. She argued that women were just as capable of virtue, learning, and leadership as their male counterparts, if only they were given the chance to prove themselves. Through a series of vivid biographical sketches, Christine celebrated the accomplishments of great female scholars, artists, warriors, and saints throughout history, from the ancient world to her own time. She highlighted women who had overcome overwhelming odds to make their mark on the world. There was the famed scholar Hypatia of Alexandria, brutally murdered by a mob for daring to teach philosophy and mathematics. The fearsome Queen Semiramis of Assyria, a brilliant military tactician who conquered vast swathes of the ancient world, and the saintly mystic Hildegard of Bingen, whose divine visions and soaring musical compositions had earned her renown throughout Christendom. With each story, Christine chipped away at the edifice of misogyny, making a powerful case for the fundamental equality of the sexes. Her radical message resonated with a small but growing audience of educated women who saw in Christine a beacon of hope in a society that sought to keep them in the shadows. Of course, Christine's proto-feminist views were not well received by the male establishment. She endured harsh criticism and mockery from some quarters, dismissed as a shrill harpy or a delusional madwoman. Her own lifelong struggle for recognition and respect was a testament to the deeply entrenched barriers faced by medieval women with ambitions beyond hearth and home. But Christine refused to be silenced. She continued to write prolifically until her death around 1430, leaving behind a body of work that would influence generations of women to come. Her legacy is a shining example of how one woman's voice raised in defiance of oppression could echo down through the centuries. As we continue our journey through the lives of medieval women, keep Christine de Peasants in mind as a rare flicker of light amidst the darkness. For most of her contemporaries, the possibilities she represented of an independent intellectual life were little more than an impossible dream. Marguerite's story illustrates the precarious position of even noble and highborn women in medieval society. Though an heiress of considerable wealth and status, she was still ultimately at the mercy of the men in her life, to be traded and treated as a possession. The fact that there were few real consequences for her husband's brazen abduction shows how such acts of gendered abuse and oppression were often tolerated or overlooked. A woman's well-being was simply not a priority. Of course, women of lower classes had it even worse. With little money or status to shield them, peasant women were easy targets for exploitation by lords, masters, and even their own husbands or fathers. Domestic abuse was rampant, seen not as a crime but as a man's way of controlling his wife and daughters. According to church doctrine, a woman's duty was to obey and submit. If she stepped out of line, violence was considered an acceptable form of discipline. Making matters worse, women had very little recourse or protection under the law. In most parts of medieval Europe, they couldn't press charges against an abuser, request a separation, or seek justice in their own name. Neighbourly intervention was rare, as domestic matters were considered private, unless abuse was egregious and notorious enough to become a public scandal. Women were expected to endure in silence. To leave a marriage was to risk complete social ruin. Only in the most extreme cases of cruelty might a noble woman appeal to her own family or the church for help. But such requests were not always heeded. After all, a wife was a husband's property, his to treat as he pleased within the privacy of the home. It was not uncommon for a beaten wife to be sent back to her abuser after a brief respite. Unless her family could afford to quietly retire her to a convent, her options were bleak. The underlying vulnerability of women's position is perhaps best exemplified by one of the most famous abduction cases of the Middle Ages, that of Marguerite of Flanders. Born in 1350, Marguerite was the only daughter of Louis XVI, Count of Flanders. As his sole heir, she stood to inherit one of the richest territories in Europe, making her a prime catch on the medieval marriage market. At the tender age of 11, she was wed to Philip of Rouvre, Duke of Burgundy, but he died just 4 years later, making teenage Marguerite a very wealthy widow in need of a new husband. Her father swiftly arranged another political match, this time to Philip the Bold, also of Burgundy. However, another suitor was waiting in the wings, Marguerite's own cousin, Louis III, Count of Flanders. Louis was eager to keep control of Flanders within the family, so in a brazen move he abducted his young cousin, spiriting her away to Ghent. The poor girl had little say in the matter, as the men in her life fought over her considerable fortune. Though her father eventually retrieved her, and saw through the original betrothal to Philip, the whole sordid affair demonstrates how even elite women were pawns in the power struggles of men. Such casual misogyny and oppression seeped into all aspects of a medieval woman's life, even the spiritual. The teachings of the Catholic Church in this period were heavily imbued with notions of female subservience, sinfulness, and sexual temptation. Ever since Eve took a bite of that forbidden fruit, women were seen as morally weaker and more prone to vice than men. As descendants of Eve, women were considered inherently more lustful, vain, emotionally unsteady, and intellectually deficient. These supposed flaws justified their subordination to cool, rational men who were tasked with controlling women's behaviour for their own good and that of society. The Church taught that virtuous women were obedient, chaste, modest, quiet and diligently domestic, always working in service of their fathers, brothers and husbands. Any deviation from this Cernus feminine ideal was swiftly condemned. Outspoken, defiant, ambitious or opinionated women were seen as unnatural and dangerous threats to the social order. And of course, those who engaged in unsanctioned sexual behaviour, sex outside of marriage, adultery or prostitution, were painted as wicked temptresses leading men into sin. Never mind that it was usually men coercing and exploiting women into such compromising situations in the first place. So it's no surprise that one of the worst labels a woman could attract was that of a witch. The medieval church saw witchcraft as the ultimate expression of feminine evil, a woman enthralled to the devil, using supernatural powers to subvert male authority and corrupt the innocent. What sort of woman would draw such dire accusations? Often she was a social outcast of some kind, a widow living alone, an unmarried older woman, a midwife or herbalist, a beggar, or someone who didn't quite fit into the prescribed role of demure wife and mother. Such vulnerable women made the perfect scapegoats for any kind of misfortune that might befall a community, from failed crops to sickness to impotence, and the flimsiest of evidence could justify horrific torture and execution methods, from burning at the stake to hanging to drowning. The much-feared witch hunts of the early modern period had their roots in the medieval church's deep distrust and demonisation of uncontrolled female power. Of course, the vast majority of women were far from powerful, quite the opposite. Whether highborn lady or lowly peasant, women led extremely circumscribed lives, their agency limited at every turn by the men who dominated them. And so they turned to prayer. Religion was one of the few spheres that offered women some measure of autonomy and self-expression, albeit in highly controlled forms. Becoming a nun was a rare alternative to marriage, allowing some women to pursue a life of the mind insulated from male demands. Female mystics were also grudgingly tolerated, even revered, so long as they confined their spiritual visions to properly doctrinal subjects. One such mystic was Julian of Norwich, an English anchoress who lived a radical form of the monastic life. In her 30s, she requested to be permanently enclosed, or anchored, in a small cell attached to a church where she would spend the rest of her days in solitary prayer and contemplation. The door to her cell was sealed shut in a solemn ceremony, with the expectation that she would never pass through it again. Even in death, her body would later be removed through the high window facing the church interior. For decades, Julian lived in this stone room, no more than 15 paces long, receiving food and necessities through a small opening. And yet this life of unimaginable isolation and deprivation was still preferable to marriage, for some women at least. As an anchoress, Julian was beholden to no man save Christ. She could devote herself fully to her spiritual practice without the burdens of domestic duties or childbearing. Through her high window, she also served as a kind of counsellor to parishioners, offering prayers and advice. In this role, she gained a measure of influence and authority rarely granted to women. Her mystical visions, recorded in her book Revelations of Divine Love, even dared to describe God in feminine terms, as a nurturing mother. For a woman to put forth her own theological interpretations was a bold move, to say the least. That her writing survived at all is a testament to the respect she commanded in her community. But Julian's unconventional life was still ultimately one of deprivation and enclosure. Like all medieval women, she lived at the mercy of a patriarchal church and society that saw the female sex as a threat to be contained. Whether trapped in a loveless marriage, confined to a draughty castle, or bricked into a monastic cell, women had precious little control over their own destinies. Their world was one of forced choices and roads not taken, of talents and dreams denied. Submission, silence and survival were the orders of the day. Medieval women may not have conceptualized their plight in terms of equality or justice, but they surely felt the constraints on their minds and bodies as a kind of slow suffocation, a narrowing of possibilities, and yet they endured. They found what slivers of light they could in the darkness. They took pride in what they could, their children, their handiwork, their faith. They sustained their communities and their families as best they knew how, and in so doing, medieval women laid the foundation for the advancements of subsequent generations. Their sacrifices, their strength and their quiet resilience paved the way for greater freedoms to come. So as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us honour these forgotten forms. Let us dream of the lives they might have lived in a world that cherished them fully. And let us carry their stories forward, recognising how far we've come and how far we still have to go. For in the end, women's history is human history. Our liberation is forever bound up with one another. And with that, I bid you good night. Rest well, dear listener, and dream of kinder times. Marguerite's harrowing tale illustrates the precarious position of even noble women in medieval society. At the whims of men, their choices and consent mattered little. A woman, especially a wife, was property to be seized and exploited. Unfortunately, such disregard for women's bodily autonomy pervaded all levels of society. Domestic violence was rampant, with husbands entitled to physically chastise their wives as they saw fit. As the 15th century Liber Extra decreed, a man may chastise his wife and beat her for her own correction, for she belongs to him, so may he chastise her. Peasant women often bore the brunt of their husbands' frustrations over gruelling field labour, meagre food, and wretched living conditions. With large families crammed into tiny cottages, privacy was non-existent and tempers short. The wine and ale consumed to stave off hunger, and contaminated water certainly didn't help matters. Higher up the social ladder, aristocratic husbands might exercise a bit more restraint with their beatings to avoid marring their wives' appearances. However, spousal abuse remained common, if more discreet. A noble woman was still her lord's property, to discipline as he pleased. Behind chamber doors, her wifely duty was to submit to his authority in all things. Of course, the ultimate violation was marital rape, a concept that didn't even exist in the medieval mindset. As marriage was primarily a vehicle for men to produce legitimate heirs, a husband had an unfettered right to sexual access to his wife's body. Her willing participation was deemed irrelevant. These attitudes were only reinforced by both religious doctrine and the era's rudimentary medical knowledge. Church teachings portrayed women as inherently sinful, lustful creatures who needed to be kept firmly under male control. Female desire was an aberration, whereas male desire was natural and unavoidable. If a husband forced himself on his wife, well, perhaps her wanting behaviour had triggered his base urges. Medical texts, meanwhile, claimed that female seed had to be warmed and stimulated to procreation by vigorous action of the male rod. Women's enjoyment was considered essential to conception. By this logic, if a wife became pregnant, surely she must have been a willing participant in the act, regardless of her objections. Between victim blaming and biological misunderstandings, women who suffered sexual violence had little recourse. Speaking out earned scorn, skepticism, and accusations of seduction. She wanted it, she tempted him into sin. The medieval rippling poem even advised, "What you can't prevent, you might as well enjoy." Thus, in the face of assault, a woman's best hope was to avoid pregnancy and additional shame. Midwives and healers passed down secret recipes for herbal abortifications and contraceptives. Pennyroyal, tansy, and certain fungi could induce miscarriage, while rue and Queen Anne's lace, or wild carrot seed, worked to prevent conception. Discreet networks of women quietly shared such illicit knowledge. However, even these small rebellions against men's tyranny over their bodies put women at risk of hemorrhage, infection and worse. Accusations of witchcraft. The medieval mindset simply could not conceive of women controlling their own reproductive fates. Anything that enabled them to thwart a husband's prerogative or a God-given pregnancy was surely the devil's work. Perhaps most tragically, some women internalized this oppression, coming to believe they deserved no better than the abuses heaped upon them. When marriage was a woman's only option and her husband her lord and master, what other choice did she have but to submit? How could she imagine any other way? Yet despite the trauma inflicted on both flesh and spirit, medieval women endured. They tended to each other's wounds, whispered words of solidarity, and in quiet moments composed lives that transcended their suffering. Through sheer grit they carried on, being beautiful wives, loving mothers, and keepers of self in a world that granted them precious little. Continuing this time-worn tradition of female resilience was an English mystic who rose to become one of the most influential Christian theologians of her age. Yet her cloistered existence began not entirely by choice, but as a last resort for an unmarriageable woman. Born in 1343, the woman history knows as Julian of Norwich was likely a surplus daughter in a noble family, fallen on hard times. With no dowry or influential connections, her options would have been bleak. A burdensome spinster dependent on begrudging relatives or a life of backbreaking farm labour. For such undesirable women, the convent offered both refuge and a veneer of respectability. Thus, in her early 30s, Julian committed herself to one of the most extreme forms of the religious life, that of an anchoress. Literally walled up in a small cell attached to the side of a church, she would spend the rest of her days in prayer and contemplation, never emerging into the light of day. The requisite ceremony carried all the gravity of a funeral mass, and understandably so. An anchorite bade a permanent farewell to the world of the living. The bishop would sprinkle the tomb of her cell with dust and intone, "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust." With the final bricking of the cell door, she was considered dead to all she previously knew. Entering her tomb while still very much alive, Julian likely felt a mixture of terror and relief. By the grace of God, she had escaped the trials of marriage and motherhood that consumed and destroyed so many women. Yet she had condemned herself to a kind of living death, trapped in a stone prison scarcely large enough to lie down in. Still, for the pious Julian, even this harsh existence must have seemed preferable to being some man's cattle. An anchoress enjoyed a degree of autonomy almost unthinkable for a medieval woman. Subsisting on alms left by the faithful, she was beholden to no husband or father. Her days were her own to spend in solitary devotion to her heavenly spouse. Moreover, in a society that regarded most women's words as worthless prattle, an anchoress's pronouncements carried rare spiritual authority. Townsfolk would flock to the small curtained opening in Julian's cell to pour out their sins and troubles, hoping to receive divine wisdom from the holy woman's lips. How medieval peasants survived the coldest winter. In the chill of the late Middle Ages, a time period spanning from the 5th to the 15th century, the lives of the peasantry were marked by their struggle against the elements. The winters were especially brutal, and survival was far from guaranteed. In this first part of our journey through history, we will explore the means by which these hardy individuals braved the harshest season of the year. The first line of defence against the cold was their homes. Peasant homes during the Middle Ages were simple structures, often comprised of just one room where eating, sleeping, and all other daily activities took place. The walls were typically made of WL and daub, a combination of wooden strips interwoven with a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung. This provided some insulation against the cold, but it was far from perfect. The houses were heated by a central hearth around which the family would gather. The fire would burn all day long, fueled by wood or peat, and the smoke from the fire would escape through a hole in the roof. This constant source of heat was vital for survival, providing warmth and a place to cook food. Clothing was another crucial aspect of survival in the cold winter months. Medieval peasants wore layers of clothing made from wool, hemp or flax. The most common garment was the tunic, a simple loose-fitting garment that covered the body from the shoulders to somewhere between the hips and the ankles. This was worn over a shirt or undergarments, and in the winter, multiple layers would be worn for added warmth. Cloaks, hoods and gloves were also common, providing additional protection against the cold. One of the biggest challenges faced by medieval peasants during the winter was the scarcity of food. Most peasants were farmers, and as such their diet was largely dependent on the crops they grew. The main staples were grains such as barley, oats and rye, which were used to make bread, porridge and ale. During the summer and autumn, the harvest would be plentiful, and the peasants would preserve as much of the food as they could for the winter months. This was done through drying, smoking and pickling techniques that allowed the food to be stored for long periods without spoiling. Livestock also played a crucial role in the peasant diet. Cows, pigs and chickens were the most common types of livestock, providing milk, meat and eggs. However, keeping these animals alive through the winter was a challenge. The animals required food and shelter, and the peasants would have to balance the need to feed their families with the need to keep their livestock alive. Often, this meant slaughtering some of the animals in the autumn and preserving the meat for the winter. Despite these challenges, medieval peasants found ways to make the most of the winter months. They would gather in their homes around the fire, telling stories and singing songs to pass the time. They would also engage in winter sports such as ice skating and snowball fights, activities that provided a welcome distraction from the hardships of daily life. In conclusion, survival for medieval peasants during the coldest winter was a combination of preparation, resourcefulness, and community. Their homes, clothing, and food were all designed to provide as much warmth and sustenance as possible. Despite the harsh conditions, they found ways to keep their spirits high and persevere through the cold. This resilience is a testament to the strength and adaptability of these individuals who faced the challenges of their time with courage and determination. As we journey further into the lives of these medieval peasants, we will see this resilience demonstrated time and again, a beacon of hope in the darkest of winters. The winter of 1315 was no ordinary winter in medieval Europe. It was the beginning of a period known as the Great Famine, a period that would last until the summer of 1317, and one of the coldest and harshest times in recorded history. The winter was so severe that it was referred to as the Year of the Great Cold or the Year of Ice. But how did the medieval peasants, the common folk of the time, survive this ferocious winter? What were their strategies, their methods, their secrets? The first thing to understand about medieval peasants is that they were largely self-reliant. They didn't have the luxuries of central heating or grocery stores. They had to rely on their own skills and resources to survive. They had to store food, make and repair clothing, build and maintain their homes, and they had to do all of this while also working the land and raising livestock. One of the most important resources for surviving the winter was food. During the autumn harvest, peasants would have worked diligently to gather as much food as possible. This included grains like wheat and barley, as well as vegetables like cabbages, onions and turnips. They also gathered nuts, berries and fruits from the forest. And if they were lucky, they might have had some livestock like chickens or pigs to provide them with meat and eggs. All of this food would have been carefully stored to ensure it lasted through the winter. Grains were particularly important. They were the staple of the peasant diet and could be stored for long periods. The grains would be ground into flour and used to make bread, the most common food in the medieval diet. Bread was eaten at every meal, often with a little cheese or some vegetables. In particularly harsh winters when food was scarce, bread might be the only food a peasant family had. Clothing was another crucial resource for surviving the winter. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of modern materials like synthetic fibres or down feathers. Instead, they relied on what was available to them: wool, linen and animal skins. Wool was the most common material for winter clothing. It was warm, durable and relatively easy to work with. Peasants would shear their sheep in the spring and then spend the summer and autumn spinning the wool into yarn and weaving it into cloth. The clothing they made was simple but effective. They wore tunics and leggings, often layered for extra warmth. They also wore cloaks, hoods and mittens, and they wrapped their feet in strips of cloth to protect them from the cold. These clothes were not just for warmth, they also served as protection against the wind and snow, which could be just as deadly as the cold itself. Shelter was equally important for surviving the winter. Medieval peasant homes were simple, usually consisting of a single room with a thatched roof and walls made of dubial and daub, a mixture of mud, straw and dung. The homes were not particularly well insulated, but they did provide some protection from the elements. To keep warm, peasants would have a fire burning in the hearth, which was usually located in the middle of the home. The fire served multiple purposes. It provided heat, of course, but it also served as a source of light and a place to cook food. Firewood would have been gathered throughout the year and carefully stored for winter. Peasants would also burn peat, type of soil that can be dried and used as fuel if they had access to it. Surviving the winter was not just about having the right resources, it was also about knowing how to use those resources effectively. Peasants had to be strategic in their use of food, clothing, and fuel. They had to ration their supplies to ensure they lasted throughout the winter. They also had to be vigilant about maintaining their homes and their clothing, repairing any damage quickly to prevent heat loss. Despite the harsh conditions and the scarcity of resources, medieval peasants were remarkably resilient. They knew how to survive, how to adapt, how to make do with what they had. They knew how to face the winter and come out the other side. It was a testament to their strength, their resourcefulness, and their determination. As we delve deeper into our journey through the past, let us pause to appreciate the resilience of the medieval peasant. Imagine, if you will, a world without central heating, weather forecasts, or supermarkets. A world where survival depends on the fruits of your own labour, and the whims of weather could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest or a barren field. This was the reality for peasants living through the coldest winters of the Middle Ages. With the harvest season coming to a close, the villagers would have spent the long autumn days gathering and storing food for the harsh winter months ahead. Hay would be stacked high in the barns to feed the livestock, and root vegetables like turnips and carrots would be carefully stored in cool, dry cellars. The fruits of the summer, such as apples, pears, and berries, would be transformed into preserves and pies, their sweetness a welcome respite in the long cold winter. Yet preparing and storing food was merely the first step in surviving the winter. Fuel for heating and cooking was just as important. Throughout the year, peasants would collect wood from the surrounding forests, fallen branches and twigs. This wood would then be carefully stored and rationed throughout the winter months. Fire was a precious resource, providing warmth and light in the long dark days and nights. It was also essential for cooking the hearty stews and broths that would sustain the villagers through the winter. The homes of medieval peasants were simple structures, usually made of WL and daub. WL and daub was a composite building material made from woven wooden strips called WBL, which was then covered with a sticky material known as daub, usually a mixture of clay, sand and straw. These homes were not particularly well insulated, and the only source of heat would be the central hearth. To keep warm, families would huddle together, sharing body heat, and thick furs and cloths would be used to cover doors and windows to keep out the cold. Clothing, too, was an important factor in surviving the winter. Wool was the most common material for clothing, as it was warm and relatively easy to produce. Peasants would raise their own sheep for wool, which would then be spun into yarn and woven into cloth. The women of the village, in particular, would spend long winter evenings spinning and weaving, creating warm clothing for their families. But winter was not just a time of hardship and survival, it was also a time of communal bonding and celebration. The long dark nights were filled with storytelling, singing and dancing. These activities not only helped to pass the time, but also served to strengthen the bonds within the community. Celebrations such as Christmas and the New Year brought a sense of joy and festivity to the bleak winter landscape. In this way, the medieval peasant not only survived, but thrived. Despite the harsh conditions of the coldest winters, their resilience, resourcefulness, and communal spirit allowed them to face the winter with strength and determination. As we lie here warm and comfortable, let us take a moment to appreciate the struggles and triumphs of these hardy ancestors. Their stories serve as a reminder of the power of human spirit and the ability to find joy and beauty even in the harshest of circumstances. So, as we continue on this historical journey, let us carry with us the lessons of the medieval peasant. Their ability to adapt and survive in the face of adversity is an inspiration to us all, and as we listen to the wind howling outside, let us give thanks for the comforts and conveniences of our modern world. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of warm hearths and hearty stews, of simple homes filled with laughter and song, and of a community united in the face of adversity. As we journey into the past, let us also journey into a deeper appreciation of our present and a greater understanding of our place in the grand tapestry of history. As the sun sunk below the horizon, the winter night laid its icy shroud over the medieval village, and the peasants retreated into their humble abodes. These homes were built primarily of timber, WL, and daub, providing a modicum of protection against the intense cold. The admixture of clay, dung, and straw had insulating properties that were quite effective in keeping the cold at bay. The floors were typically made of packed earth, a seemingly harsh and unforgiving surface, but a layer of straw or reeds was often strewn across it, offering a semblance of warmth. Within these homes, the peasants' furniture was sparse and utilitarian, a rough-hewn table and a few. Stools typically comprised the entirety of their furnishings, but the centrepiece of the home was the hearth, a life-giving source of warmth, light, and sustenance. The hearth was a place for cooking, a place for gathering, a place where stories were told and songs were sung. The crackling fire was a beacon of hope in the long, dreary winter months. Winter brought with it a dearth of fresh food, but the medieval peasants were well acquainted with the art of preservation. They salted, pickled and dried their produce and meats, ensuring they had enough sustenance to last through the cold season. In addition to these, grains stored from the autumn harvest were ground into flour and made into hearty breads. Root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips and carrots were stored in cool, dark places to prevent them from rotting. Furthermore, they relied heavily on their livestock, not just for meat, but also for milk, cheese and wool. The peasants were also resourceful in their clothing. They spun wool into yarn and wove it into coarse but warm cloth. Layering was key to surviving the winter. They wore multiple layers of these woolen garments and often lined them with fur or leather for additional insulation. Footwear was also essential in maintaining body heat. They made shoes and boots out of leather, stuffing them with straw or fur for added warmth. The winter, despite its harshness, was not just a season of survival, but also a time for celebration. The Christmas season was a time of great festivity for the medieval peasant. It was a time for feasting, for dancing, for merriment. The Yule log, a massive piece of wood, was burned in the hearth, and its warmth and light were symbolic of hope and rejuvenation. The peasants believed that as long as the Yule log burned, they would be protected from the evils of winter. Winter was also a time of rest for the peasant. The fields lay dormant under a blanket of snow and there was little work to be done. This provided them with a much-needed respite from the gruelling labour of the other seasons. They used this time to mend their tools, to weave and sew, to craft and create. The village would come together during this time, sharing stories, sharing food, sharing warmth. It was a time of community, of camaraderie, of shared hardship and shared joy. The cold winter nights were long and the days were short. But within the confines of their humble homes, around the warmth of the hearth, the peasants found comfort and solace in the face of the harshest winter. The medieval peasant was a testament to resilience and resourcefulness. They understood the rhythm of the seasons, the ebb and flow of life. They knew the winter was a time of hardship, but they also knew it was a time of rest, a time of celebration, a time of community. They understood that the winter was not just a season to endure, but a season to embrace. As we delve deeper into the life of the medieval peasant, we can see that while their existence was indeed harsh and fraught with difficulties, it was also a life of simplicity, of community, and of resilience. Despite the challenges that winter brought, they persevered, they adapted, they endured, and in doing so they left us with a legacy of strength and fortitude that continues to inspire us today. Our journey into the lives of the medieval peasants during the coldest winters continues. In this segment, we'll delve into the heart of their homes, the humble abode that offered them shelter, warmth, and a semblance of comfort amidst the harsh conditions. The peasant's house, often a one-room structure made of WL and daub, provided a haven from the winter's biting cold. Biel and daub was a composite building material used for making walls, in which a woven lattice of wooden strips, the WLE, was daubed with a sticky material, usually made of some combination of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and straw. The houses were typically small, the average wood being around 10 or 15 feet, but they were sturdy, warm, and waterproof thanks to the ingenious use of readily available materials. The roofs were thatched using straw or reeds, providing insulation against the cold. Inside this humble dwelling there was a central hearth which provided heat for cooking and warmth. The smoke from the fire would rise and escape through a hole in the roof, which also allowed for some natural light to filter in. The house was sparsely furnished with a rough-hewn table, some wooden stools and a straw mattress, providing the basic comforts. The floor was often just a bare, hard-packed earth, sometimes strewn with straw for additional insulation and warmth. Despite these modest trappings, the peasant's house was a sanctuary, a place of refuge against the brutal winters that would often last many months. Food during these cold months was scarce but not entirely absent. The peasants would have harvested their crops in the fall and stored them for the winter. They relied heavily on grains such as barley, oats and rye, which could be ground into flour and baked into bread. They also grew vegetables that could withstand the winter cold such as cabbages, turnips and onions. Beans and peas provided a vital source of protein, while apples and pears could be stored for long periods. The peasants also kept livestock, which provided them with milk, cheese and occasionally meat. Chickens offered eggs, and pigs, which were often slaughtered in early winter, provided meat that could be salted and smoked for preservation. Hunting and foraging supplemented their diet with wild game, fish, berries and nuts, adding variety and vital nutrients. The cold winter months were also a time for certain types of work. The men would engage in woodcutting, not only for firewood but also to provide timber for building and repairing houses, fences and farm tools. The women, besides their relentless work in the house, would also engage in spinning and weaving, producing wool and flax for clothing and bedding. Despite the harsh conditions, the peasants found ways to cheer themselves during the long winter nights. Storytelling was a popular pastime with tales of heroism, romance, and magic. These stories, handed down from generation to generation, provided entertainment, moral instruction, and a sense of identity. This resilient survival of the medieval peasants during the coldest winters speaks volumes about their unwavering spirit and resourcefulness. The warmth of their hearth, the sustenance of their stored harvest and livestock, the shelter of their humble abode, and the unity of their community formed the bulwark against the biting cold and the biting scarcity. The next time you find yourself shivering on a cold winter's day, spare a thought for these hardy souls of yesteryears and their enduring legacy. And let us now navigate to the heart of the medieval village, where the peasants, the backbone of the medieval society, resided. When the winter months rolled in, their lives transformed, dictated by the harsh elements. Imagine the scene as the first snowflakes started to fall, covering the ground in a blanket of white. The once bustling village square became desolate and quiet, save for the crackling fires emanating from the cottages, smoke billowing out from their chimneys. The cottages themselves were humble structures, built from local materials. In areas abundant in timber, wooden planks were used for the walls and roof. In regions with less timber, they resorted to a technique called WL and daub, where woven wooden strips were plastered with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were typically thatched using straw or reed, providing a decent insulation against the cold. A central hearth provided warmth and a place to cook, with the smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. The peasants' diet also shifted with the seasons. During the summer months, they enjoyed a diverse range of food, including fresh fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. In winter, however, their diet mainly consisted of preserved foods. Drying, smoking, and salting were common methods of preservation. Meat, if they were fortunate enough to have it, was salted and smoked. Fruits and vegetables were dried or stored in root cellars. Grains were milled into flour for bread, and legumes were a valuable source of protein. Winter was also a period of relative rest for the medieval peasant. The fields were barren, and there was little work to be done on the farm. However, this did not mean they were idle. The peasants used this downtime to mend tools, repair buildings, and weave cloth. Women spent long hours spinning wool into yarn, a task that could be done by the fire's light. They also made candles from animal fat, which would provide light during the dark winter nights. The cold, although harsh, also brought with it certain benefits. For instance, the ground's freezing made it easier to transport heavy loads. Logs, stones, and other heavy materials could be dragged over the frozen ground with relative ease. The frozen rivers and lakes also provided a means for travel and transport. In fact, in some regions, ice roads formed an extensive transport network during the winter months. In terms of clothing, the peasants layered themselves to combat the cold. They wore tunics made from wool or hemp, and cloaks were common. Footwear was typically made from leather, stuffed with straw for additional insulation. Hoods, mittens, and scarves protected them from the biting wind. The wealthy could afford fur, but for the average peasant, warmth came from layered clothing and huddling together for warmth. Peasants also found solace and warmth in their community during the harsh winter months. They gathered around the hearth, sharing stories and songs, passing down traditions and folklore. It was a time for kinship and camaraderie, a time to strengthen the bonds of the community. The church also played a crucial role, providing spiritual comfort and sometimes physical aid to the most vulnerable. Despite the challenges, the medieval peasants' winter was not a time of despair. Instead, it was a time of resilience, a testament to their ability to adapt and survive in the face of adversity. They found ways to thrive, relying on their resourcefulness, their community, and their indomitable spirit. As we conclude this section, picture once again the snow-covered medieval village, the cottages with their smoke-filled chimneys, the peasants huddled together for warmth. Their lives were not easy, but they persevered, finding joy and warmth even in the coldest winter. As you drift off to sleep, let their resilience inspire you, reminding you of the strength within us all. In the midst of the harshest winter, the medieval peasant's life was a testament to human resilience and the determination to survive. The coldest months tested their mettle, pushing them to the brink, yet they found ways to endure and persist. This section will delve into the different techniques and strategies that the medieval peasants employed to withstand the freezing temperatures and keep the biting cold at bay. Firstly, let's consider their homes. Mostly made from WLE and daub, a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung, these insulated structures were the first line of defence against the cold. The walls were thick and sturdy, providing a barrier against the icy winds. The roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, offering further insulation. Inside, the floors were covered with rushes or straw to provide a degree of insulation from the cold ground. A central hearth provided heat and a place to cook food. It was a simple yet effective design, capitalising on the materials and resources at hand to create a warm and comfortable living space. Next, we need to look at how they dressed. Layers were the key to survival. Peasants wore undergarments made of linen, while the outer layers were usually wool, a material known for its excellent insulating properties. A thick woolen cloak would be draped over the shoulders, providing an additional layer of warmth. In addition, they would wear mittens or gloves and wrap their feet in cloth or wear wooden clogs to protect them from the freezing ground. These pieces of clothing provided the much-needed warmth during the coldest days and nights. Food was another critical factor in their survival. The peasants' diet consisted mainly of grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally a small amount of meat. During the winter, they relied on preserved foods like pickles, dried fruits, cured meats, and grains stored from the autumn harvest. These foods were hearty and nutritious, providing the energy needed to withstand the cold. They also brewed ale and mead, which were thought to provide warmth and, in some cases, might have been the only source of safe drinking water when sources froze over. Firewood was a crucial resource during the harsh winter. Gathering and storing enough firewood before the onset of winter was a priority for every family. The wood was used to heat their homes and cook their food. It was a continuous cycle of gathering, chopping and storing, done with the knowledge that their survival depended on it. In the midst of these harsh conditions, social structures and community bonds played a significant role in survival. Villages operated as a collective unit, sharing resources and labour. If a family couldn't gather enough firewood, for example, their neighbours would step in to help. This sense of community and mutual aid was a lifeline for many during the coldest winters. Lastly, the church played a significant role in the survival of the medieval peasants. The church provided spiritual guidance, but also physical support. It often acted as a storehouse for grain and other foodstuffs, which could be distributed to the needy in times of scarcity. The medieval peasants' struggle to survive the coldest winter was fraught with challenges. Yet through ingenuity, resilience, and community support, they found ways to endure. Each year, when spring arrived, it was a testament to their strength and determination, a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity in the face of adversity. The medieval peasants navigated the harsh realities of their daily lives, especially during the coldest winter. As we delve deeper into the life of medieval peasant during the winter season, it becomes clear that their existence was a careful balance of survival tactics, community cooperation, and an intimate knowledge of their environment. This harsh season was a test of endurance and ingenuity, where success meant seeing the advent of spring. During these relentless winters, shelter was of utmost necessity. The homes of peasants, also known as vels, were typically constructed from WL and daub, a mixture of mud, straw and manure, which provided surprisingly effective insulation against the biting cold. The roofs were thatched with straw, reeds or rushes, offering a modicum of warmth and protection from the snow. A central hearth would be kept alight as much as possible, both for warmth and cooking purposes. The vel was often filled with smoke, as they lacked chimneys. and this would escape through a hole in the roof or the door. Fuel for the fire was a crucial resource during winter. While wood was the ideal choice, it was often scarce due to deforestation and the Lord's restrictions on gathering from the local forest. Peasants would resort to using dried peat, animal dung, or even twisted straw, referred to as fire bundles. These alternatives produced less heat and more smoke, making the living conditions in the Hickveld less than ideal, but it was a necessary compromise for survival. Medieval peasants, despite their impoverished status, were astute in their understanding of preserving food for the winter. Autumn was a flurry of activity as they harvested grains, fruits and vegetables, curing meats and making cheese. Grains were milled into flour and stored for making bread, while fruits and vegetables were pickled or dried. Livestock unable to be sustained through the winter were slaughtered, and the meat was salted or smoked to prevent it from spoiling. Cheese was made from the milk of cows and goats, providing a high-calorie food source that could be stored for months. These preserved foods formed the basis of the peasants' winter diet, supplemented occasionally by hunting or fishing. Hunting and fishing were not always reliable food sources during the winter months. Many animals hibernated or migrated, and bodies of water often froze over, making it difficult to catch fish. However, peasants could trap small game like rabbits or birds, and ice fishing was a common practice. They would cut a hole in the ice and lower a line baited with pieces of meat or bread. If they were fortunate, this would provide a much-needed source of fresh protein during the lean winter months. Community was key in surviving these long, harsh winters. The feudal system, rigid as it was, fostered a sense of shared responsibility among the peasants. They worked together to gather and store firewood, repair and reinforce their homes against the winter storms, and share food resources. The Lord of the Manor also had a vested interest in the survival of his serfs, as they were his primary labour force. Therefore, in particularly harsh winters, the Lord might distribute extra rations or offer shelter in the manor house itself. Religion also played a significant role in the peasants' winter survival. The medieval church was a powerful institution and provided both spiritual and practical support. Prayer and faith were seen as crucial tools for survival, and many winter festivals and traditions had religious significance. Moreover, the church often acted as a source of charity, providing food and clothing to those most in need during the winter months. The trials of a medieval winter were undoubtedly harsh, and the threat of illness, hunger, and cold was ever present. However, through a combination of practical skills, community cooperation, and religious faith, the medieval peasant found ways to endure and survive. Their resilience and resourcefulness in the face of such adversity are a testament to the human spirit's capacity to adapt and overcome. In the next section, we will explore more about the social and cultural aspects of the medieval peasant's life during winter, including festivities, leisure activities, and how they made use of the limited daylight hours. Their lives were not merely about survival, but also about finding joy and meaning amidst the hardship. This is an aspect of their existence that is often overlooked, yet it offers valuable insight into the human experience during this fascinating period in history. As the medieval winter drew on, the peasants adapted their daily routines to the ebbing daylight and the deepening cold. They woke at dawn as always, but dawn came later and later as the solstice approached. They had to make the most of the daylight hours, squeezing in as much work as possible before nightfall, when the only light available was the dim glow of the hearth fire or the feeble flicker of a rushlight. During the day, the men ventured outside to tend to the animals, chop firewood, and carry out any necessary repairs to the buildings or fences. Their clothing was simple, often just a woolen tunic and trousers with a cloak or shawl for extra warmth. They wore wooden clogs on their feet stuffed with straw to provide some insulation against the cold ground. Despite the harsh conditions, they worked hard, driven by the knowledge that the survival of their family and their village depended on their efforts. Meanwhile, the women stayed indoors as much as possible, where it was warmer and they could keep an eye on the children. They were busy with their own tasks, cooking, cleaning, spinning, weaving, mending, but they also had to make sure the fire was kept burning, both for heat and for cooking. They used a variety of fuels, from firewood and peat to dried cow dung, whatever was available. Keeping the home fires burning was a vital task, and it was carried out with a quiet sense of duty and determination. The children had their own roles to play in the family's survival. The older ones helped with the chores, both indoors and out, while the younger ones played near the hearth, staying warm and safe under their mother's watchful eye. Sometimes they would be sent out to gather firewood or to fetch water from the well, tasks that could be accomplished quickly and without straying too far from the safety of the home. Food was scarce in winter, and the peasants had to make do with what they had stored away during the harvest season. They ate a lot of bread made from barley or rye, and supplemented this with whatever vegetables they had managed to preserve, such as onions, turnips, and cabbages. Meat was a rare treat, usually reserved for special occasions, but they might have a little cheese or milk from the family cow. They also ate a lot of pottage, a thick, hearty stew made from whatever ingredients were available. It was not a varied diet, but it provided the necessary calories to keep them going through the cold winter months. In the evenings, they gathered around the fire for warmth and companionship. They told stories, sang songs, played simple games, and perhaps enjoyed a little homemade ale or cider. Despite the hardships, they found ways to amuse themselves and keep their spirits up. The long, cold winter nights could be a time of hardship, but they could also be a time of closeness and camaraderie, a time when the bonds of family and community were strengthened. As the winter wore on, the peasants faced many challenges. They had to deal with the cold, the scarcity of food, and the threat of disease. They had to work hard, and they had to rely on each other for survival. But they also found ways to enjoy themselves, to make the most of what they had, and to celebrate the simple joys of life. Then, as the days began to lengthen and the first signs of spring appeared, they prepared for the new growing season. They repaired their tools, cleaned their fields, and planned their crops. They looked forward to the warmth and abundance of summer, but they also knew that they had survived another winter, and that gave them a sense of accomplishment and satisfaction. So as we conclude this section, we are left with a vivid image of the resilience and tenacity of the medieval peasants. Despite the harsh conditions and the many challenges they faced, they found ways to survive and even to thrive. They were a testament to the human spirit, and their story is a reminder of the strength and resilience lie within us all. As we drift into sleep, we carry with us the stories of these hardy souls, their struggles and triumphs providing a soothing lullaby of human resilience and hope. In the midst of the chilling winter of the Middle Ages, the survival of the medieval peasants hinged upon a delicate balance of foresight, physical labour, and the mercy of the elements. A peasant's existence was one of ceaseless toil and hardship, and winter was an especially taxing season. The frosty months were not just a period of biting cold and shorter days. They were a time fraught with the threat of starvation, disease, and even death. The peasants had to utilise all their resources and knowledge to make it through the harsh winter months. The medieval peasants' preparations for winter began long before the first frost. In the late summer months, the peasants were busy harvesting their crops, knowing that the bounty gathered would be their primary source of sustenance during the winter. Grains such as wheat, barley, and rye were harvested and stored in granaries, their golden kernels promising sustenance in the bleak months ahead. These grains were ground into flour and baked into bread, a staple in the medieval peasants' diet. Without these gathered crops, the harsh winter would become a death sentence. Along with the grains, the peasants also harvested vegetables like cabbages, turnips, and onions. These were stored in cellars or pits, cool and dark places that would keep the vegetables from rotting. They also gathered fruits and berries, which were preserved for winter by drying or making them into preserves. These fruits and vegetables were not just a source of food, but also provided much-needed vitamins and nutrients that helped keep disease at bay during the winter months. Yet even with such preparations, winter was a challenging time. The peasants had to contend with the dwindling daylight hours and the relentless cold. A typical medieval peasant's house was a simple one-room structure with walls made of wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. A thatched roof provided some insulation from the cold, but it was the hearth, a fireplace in the centre of the house, that was the primary source of heat. Firewood was essential for the winter, providing heat and a way to cook food. Throughout the warmer months, the peasants would gather wood, chopping down trees and gathering fallen branches. This wood was carefully stacked and stored, ready to feed the hungry hearth when the cold set in. The fire was a lifeline, its warmth a bastion against the icy fingers of winter that sought to creep into every corner of the peasant's home. The bitter cold was not the only danger that winter brought. Snow and ice made travel hazardous, isolating villages and making it difficult to trade or seek help. The peasants had to rely on their community, sharing resources and helping one another to survive. They would huddle around the fire, sharing stories and songs to lift their spirits, their breath clouding in the cold air. The firelight would flicker, casting long shadows on the walls, a small beacon of warmth and life in the gloom of winter. Winter was also a time of disease. The close quarters and poor sanitation meant that illnesses could spread quickly. Common ailments included respiratory infections brought on by the cold and damp, as well as malnutrition-related diseases. The peasants had to rely on their knowledge of herbs and natural remedies to combat these illnesses, as professional medical help was often out of their reach. Despite these challenges, the medieval peasants found ways to endure the winter. They relied on their ingenuity and resilience, their strong sense of community, and their deep connection to the land. Their lives were shaped by the seasons, their survival a testament to their tenacity and resourcefulness in the face of adversity. As the first signs of spring began to appear, and the icy grip of winter began to thaw, they would breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that they had once again survived the coldest season. So as we delve further into the harsh winters of the Middle Ages, let us remember the resilient spirit of the medieval peasants, their struggles and their triumphs. For they were not just victims of their time, but survivors, their lives a testament to the enduring human will to survive and thrive even in the harshest conditions. Their story is not just a tale of survival, but a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a testament to our shared history. As the sun set, the winter nights in a medieval peasant's life were long, cold, and often fraught with hardship. The temperature would drop rapidly, and the darkness would descend upon the land, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that would seep into every corner of their modest homes. Their homes were often single-room structures, with walls made of WL and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, which provided some insulation against the cold, but not enough to keep it at bay entirely. The floors were made of compacted earth, covered with straw or reeds for warmth. The roof was thatched with straw, which was an effective insulator but could also be a fire hazard. There was usually a central hearth for cooking and heating, but the smoke often filled the room, as there were seldom proper chimneys. The lack of ventilation could lead to respiratory problems, particularly in the young and the elderly. Their beds were typically made of straw or dried ferns, covered with a cloth or animal hide. It was common for the entire family to sleep together for warmth, layered in whatever clothing they had, often sharing their living space with their livestock, whose body heat provided additional warmth. The domestic animals were not just essential for sustenance, but also played a vital role in providing heat during the bitterly cold nights. In these challenging conditions, the peasants' diet played a crucial role in their survival. Their food was simple but hearty. The mainstay of their diet was dark bread made from rye or barley. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips and onions were common, as were cabbages and leeks. They also ate peas, beans and lentils, often made into a thick, warming pottage, a kind of stew made from whatever ingredients were available, cooked over the open hearth. They preserved food for the winter months by drying, smoking or salting. Meat was a rarity, usually only eaten on special occasions or during the winter, when it was too costly to keep feeding the animals, and it was during these cold months that they could tap into their carefully preserved stores of food. The livestock that could not be maintained through the winter were slaughtered, providing the peasants with a rare bounty of meat, which they would salt and smoke to ensure it lasted throughout the season. Their drink was usually ale or beer, made from barley and often brewed at home. Water was not always safe to drink, so these weak ales provided hydration as well as calories. In some regions, they also had access to cider or mead. Milk was also drunk and was used to make cheese and butter, but it did not keep well, so it was often turned into these longer-lasting products. The cold environment and lack of sunlight during the winter months also led to a deficiency of vitamin D, which is crucial for the absorption of calcium and phosphorus in the body. This deficiency could lead to health problems like rickets in children and osteomalacia in adults, conditions that weaken the bones. However, the consumption of fish, particularly oily fish like herring, which was often smoked or salted for preservation, provided them with some vitamin D. Despite these hardships, the medieval peasants found ways to survive and even find joy in the cold winter months. Winter was a time for storytelling and music. They would gather around the hearth, sharing tales, singing songs, and playing simple instruments. These were precious moments of warmth and light in the dark, cold winter, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit echoing down the ages to us. These were the people who, despite their hardships, laid the foundations of the world we live in today. As we drift off into sleep, we carry with us a sense of gratitude for their struggles and their strength. As we delve further into the lives of the medieval peasantry during the coldest winter months, it becomes evident that survival was not merely a result of happenstance. Rather, it was the fruit of meticulous planning, community cooperation, and a profound understanding of the land and its patterns. Let's now turn our attention to the ingenious methods employed by the peasantry to ensure their survival. One such method was the storage of food. It is crucial to understand that in a society devoid of modern refrigeration, the preservation and safekeeping of food was an art form in itself. The peasants harvested crops during the warmer seasons, but they knew that the yield had to last throughout the harsh, barren winter months. Thus they devoted a significant amount of time to drying, pickling and smoking food. This was done not just at an individual level, but was a collective effort, with the entire village participating in the process. They stored grains in airtight containers, hung meats in smokehouses, and sealed fruits in jars after pickling them. This food was carefully rationed, and was supplemented by whatever meagre produce the winter months had to offer. Shelter was another significant aspect of winter survival. The homes of medieval peasants were made of wlee and daub, a mixture of straw, clay and animal dung. The thick, insulating walls provided a barrier against the cold, while the thatched roofs prevented snow from entering. However, these homes were not perfect. They were often damp and cold, and the peasants would huddle around the hearth for warmth. To compensate for the lack of adequate heating, peasants used straw or reed mats on the floors and hung heavy tapestries or animal skins on the walls to preserve heat. Clothing played an equally important role in winter survival. Peasants wore layers of clothing made from fabrics like wool, linen, and hemp. These materials were readily available and could be woven into sturdy, warm garments. Cloaks and shawls were common, and footwear was typically made from leather or wood, lined with straw to provide insulation against the cold ground. In addition to these physical preparations, peasants also relied on their close-knit community for survival. In times of scarcity, neighbours would share food and resources, ensuring that no one went without. This sense of unity and solidarity was a defining characteristic of medieval peasant life, and it was particularly evident during the challenging winter months. Moreover, the peasants understood the importance of maintaining their health during these strenuous times. They made use of herbal remedies and folklore medicine to treat common ailments. Knowledge of these remedies was passed down through generations and was an integral part of their survival strategy. Equally important was their spiritual faith. The harsh winters were often seen as a test of their faith, and the peasants would turn to prayer for comfort and guidance. The local church was a refuge, a place of warmth and community where they could find solace amidst the hardship. As we delve deeper into the medieval winter, we begin to see the resilience and adaptability of the peasants. Despite the harsh conditions, they found ways to endure and even thrive. Their survival was a testament to their resourcefulness, their understanding of the natural world, and their ability to work together as a community. As you drift further into sleep, let the stories of these resilient individuals lull you into a peaceful slumber. Imagine the warmth of the hearth, the comfort of the community, and the satisfaction of a well-stored pantry. As we continue our journey, let the tales of the medieval peasantry warm your dreams, just as their strategies warmed their homes during the coldest winters. In the heart of winter, the medieval peasant's life was dictated by the sun. As the daylight hours dwindled, so too did the workday. Their routine changed from the labour-intensive tasks of the warmer months to those that could be performed indoors or required less daylight. And yet the cold winter days were not entirely devoid of work. For the diligent peasant, there was always something that needed tending to, whether it was the family's livestock, the preparation of food, or even the simple act of keeping. The home warm, the fireplaces in most peasant homes were not equipped with chimneys, allowing the smoke to fill the living space before escaping through small openings in the roof. The smoke helped to deter insects and made the thatch less flammable, but it also made the indoor air quality rather poor during the winter months. Consequently, maintaining a constant fire was a delicate balance. The fire would need to be large enough to provide warmth, but not so large as to suffocate the occupants with smoke. This was a skill that was learned early in life and perfected over time. Firewood, a crucial commodity during the winter, was collected throughout the year. The right to gather firewood was often included in the peasant's tenancy agreement with the local lord. Knowing how much wood to gather, how to store it properly, and how to burn it most efficiently was a matter of survival. The best firewood was dry, seasoned hardwood like oak, which burned slowly and gave off substantial heat. Peasants would spend many an autumn day gathering and chopping wood, preparing for the long winter ahead. Keeping warm wasn't the only challenge the medieval peasants faced during winter. Food preservation was another important and often tricky task. In the months leading up to winter, peasants would have harvested their crops and slaughtered most of their livestock, keeping only breeding pairs. The meat was then preserved, usually by smoking or salting, to ensure it would last the winter. Vegetables, grains, and fruits were also preserved in various ways. Grains were dried and stored to make bread throughout the winter. Vegetables like onions, garlic, and carrots were often stored in a Hessen sack in a cool, dry place. Fruits were turned into preserves, and herbs were dried and stored for medicinal use. The importance of these food storage techniques cannot be overstated. During the harshest months of winter, a family's survival could depend on what they had successfully managed to store away during the harvest season. It was not uncommon for food supplies to run dangerously low towards the end of winter, and peasants had to be creative to make their resources last. Indeed, the winter period was a time of careful resource management for the medieval peasant, but it also offered a break from the relentless pace of work required in the warmer months. With less daylight and fewer tasks to be done, winter was a time for rest and recuperation. It was a time for families to come together, to tell stories, and to pass on the skills and knowledge that were crucial for survival. This period of relative calm was also a time for spirituality. The peasant calendar was marked by numerous religious holidays, many of which fell during the winter months. These holidays offered a welcome respite from the daily grind and were often the only times when peasants could enjoy a modicum of leisure. Despite the hardships, winter was not just a time of survival for the medieval peasant. It was a time to rest, to connect with family, and to prepare for the coming year. The resilience, resourcefulness, and sheer determination of these individuals laid the foundations for the societies we live in today. Their survival strategies, honed over centuries, provide us a glimpse into a time that was harsh, yet filled with a determination and hope that spring would soon return. During the bitterly cold winters of the Middle Ages, the survival of the peasants was indeed a challenge that was met with resilience and ingenuity. They had to find ways to keep warm, feed themselves and their livestock, and maintain their homes and tools in a time when modern conveniences were not yet available. The primary source of warmth during the medieval era was fire. Fireplaces were common in the homes of the peasants. They were not the grand, ornate hearths that you might see in the homes of the nobility, but rather simple structures constructed of stone or clay. Wood was the main fuel for these fires, but it was not always readily available, especially during the harshest of winters. As a result, peasants often used other things to fuel their fires. This included dried animal dung, peat, and even straw, which were all resources readily available on their farms. As the fire roared and crackled, it not only provided warmth but also a means of cooking food. In the medieval times, the diet of the peasants was simple and hearty. During the winter, they relied heavily on preserved foods. This included dried meats, pickled vegetables, and fermented foods like sauerkraut. These foods were all stored in root cellars, which were dug deep into the ground to take advantage of the earth's natural insulation. The peasants would also have a supply of grains like barley and rye, which they could use to make bread or porridge. Animals were a vital part of the peasants' survival during the winter. Livestock provided not only food but also other resources. Sheep, for instance, offered wool for making warm clothing and blankets. The peasants would shear the sheep before winter, spinning the wool into yarn and then weaving it into cloth. Chickens provided eggs, an excellent source of nutrition during the lean winter months, and cows provided milk, which could be made into cheese and butter. Maintenance of homes and tools was another critical aspect of survival. Peasants' homes were typically made from WLE and daub, a combination of woven branches and clay. Over time, the weather would cause the clay to crack and fall away, leaving gaps that would allow the cold winter wind to seep in. Therefore, before winter set in, the peasants would perform necessary repairs to ensure their homes were as insulated as possible. They would patch up any holes with fresh daub, layer of straw to the roof for added insulation. Tools, too, needed to be in good working order, so sharpening blades, repairing handles and oiling hinges were all common tasks. As winter approached, peasants also had to prepare for the lack of daylight. During the winter months, they made candles from tallow, which is animal fat, to provide light. The process of making tallow candles was labour-intensive, involving rendering the fat, soaking the wicks in the liquid tallow, and then allowing them to harden. But the payoff was the ability to extend their productive hours into the evening, which was particularly useful during the short winter days. The harsh reality of the medieval winters often brought communities together. Neighbours would help each other with preparations and share resources. They would gather around the fire in the evenings, sharing stories and songs and finding comfort in each other's company. This sense of community was a vital part of their survival strategy. In conclusion, the survival of the medieval peasants during the coldest winter was a testament to their resilience and resourcefulness. They made the best use of what they had, worked together as a community, and found ways to thrive in the face of adversity. It is a fascinating glimpse into a time when survival was not taken for granted, but rather was a hard-earned achievement. As we glide through the icy timeline of medieval winters, we now find ourselves situated in the heart of a particularly harsh cold season. Our subject of focus, the medieval peasants, had already expended considerable energy ensuring that their homes were well prepared for the encroaching chill. Their homes, generally composed of WLE and daub, were reinforced with thatching for insulation. The hearth would typically enjoy a steady supply of firewood, providing a valuable source of warmth for the entire household. Yet as we delve deeper into the realities of this period, we discovered that the severity of the winter season was not merely a matter of cold temperatures. The winter also brought with it a scarcity of resources, making survival a struggle for many. The scarcity of food during the winter months was a significant challenge for the medieval peasants. Their diet during this season was largely limited to preserved food, primarily salted meat and pickled vegetables. They'd spent the warmer months cultivating their crops and raising their livestock, using the autumn season to harvest and preserve much of these resources as possible. They'd store these provisions in a cellar, cool and dark, where the food could endure the long winter months. The peasants also depended on hunting and foraging for sustenance, although these activities became increasingly difficult as the cold weather set in. In addition to the lack of food, the winter months also presented a challenge in terms of water availability. The rivers and streams would often freeze over, making it difficult for the peasants to access fresh water. They developed ingenious solutions to this problem, such as melting snow or ice over the fire to obtain drinking water. This was a labour-intensive process, but it was essential for their survival. While the peasants battled the cold, they also had to contend with a variety of health issues. The lack of sunlight during the winter months often led to vitamin D deficiency, resulting in a condition known as rickets. This disease, characterised by soft, weak bones, was prevalent among children. The peasants also faced the risk of frostbite and hypothermia, conditions that could prove fatal if left untreated. Despite these harsh conditions, the peasants found ways to persevere. They would huddle together for warmth, often sharing the same bed to conserve body heat. Clothing was layered and made from wool or fur whenever possible. They kept their feet wrapped in straw or cloth to prevent frostbite and covered their heads with woolen caps or hoods. The villagers would also turn to their community for support during these tough times. The concept of barn raising, where the entire village would come together to construct a barn for a neighbour, is a well-known example of this community spirit. They would share resources, assist each other in hunting and foraging, and provide care for the sick and elderly. The church played a significant role in the lives of the medieval peasants, especially during the winter months. It was not just a place of worship, but also a source of physical and spiritual support. The church would often distribute food and clothing to the needy, and provide shelter for those without a home. The clergy would also offer prayers and blessings for the villagers, providing them with a sense of hope and resilience during these challenging times. The winter months were also a time for storytelling and passing down traditions. The peasants would gather around the fire, sharing tales of bravery and adventure, folklore and fables. These stories served to entertain and educate, providing a welcome distraction from the harsh reality of their surroundings. In the face of adversities and hardships, the medieval peasants demonstrated remarkable fortitude and resilience. Their survival strategies, born out of necessity and resourcefulness, offer a poignant testament to the human spirit's ability to endure and adapt. And so, as we continue to journey through the frost-laden landscape of medieval winters, we gain a deeper appreciation for the trials and triumphs of these humble individuals, whose stories continue to resonate across the corridors of time. As the bitter winds of winter blew across the medieval landscape, the peasants faced another challenge in their struggle for survival. The scarcity of food during these frosty months was a grave concern, and it was during this time that their resourcefulness truly shone. The preservation techniques they had carefully employed during the abundant seasons now ensured their sustenance.